I believe that the systematic mass incarceration of poor people of color is tantamount to a new caste system, one specifically designed to address the social, political, and economic challenges of our time. There was a time when I resisted comparisons between mass incarceration and Jim Crow and mass incarceration and slavery, believing that those kinds of comparisons were exaggerations, distortions, and were actually more likely to do harm than good to efforts to reform the criminal justice system and achieve greater racial equality in the United States. But after years of working on issues of racial profiling, representing victims of racial profiling, police brutality, investigating patterns of drug law enforcement in poor communities of color, and attempting to assist people to quote unquote re-enter into a society that never seemed to have much use for them in the first place, I had a series of experiences that began what I call my awakening. I began to awaken to a racial reality that seems so obvious to me now that what seems odd in retrospect is that I had been blind to it for so long. When I joined the ACLU, I was director of the Racial Justice Project for the ACLU in Northern California. I assumed that our criminal justice system had problems of racial bias, much in the same way all institutions in our society are infected to some degree or another with conscious or unconscious bias and stereotyping. And so I thought, well, I have a lot of experience in the employment discrimination field. I had been working at a firm suing Fortune 500 companies for employment discrimination. I thought, well, I'll just use the tools that I had developed in the employment discrimination context as a civil rights lawyer and apply them to criminal justice reform and work with others to root out racial bias wherever it might rear its ugly head in the criminal justice system. But by the time I left the ACLU, I had come to suspect that I was wrong about the criminal justice system. It's not just another institution in our society infected with racial bias, but a different beast entirely. That mass incarceration of poor people of color now operates as a fully comprehensive and well-disguised system of racial control analogous to Jim Crow. I state my basic thesis in the introduction where I write, what has changed since the collapse of Jim Crow has less to do with the basic structure of our society than the language we use to justify it. In the era of colorblindness, it's no longer socially permissible to use race explicitly as a justification for discrimination, exclusion, and social contempt. So we don't. Rather than rely on race, we use our criminal justice system to label people of color criminals and then engage in all the practices we supposedly left behind. Today, it is perfectly legal to discriminate against criminals in nearly all the ways it was once legal to discriminate against African Americans. Once you're labeled a felon, the old forms of discrimination, employment discrimination, housing discrimination, denial of the right to vote, exclusion from jury service, are suddenly legal. As a criminal, you have scarcely more rights and arguably less respect than a black man living in Alabama at the height of Jim Crow. We have not ended racial caste in America, we have merely redesigned it. Now, here are a few of the facts that I uncovered in the course of researching the book that were part of my awakening. More African American adults are under correctional control today, in prison or jail, on probation or parole, than were enslaved in 1850, a decade before the Civil War began. In 2004, more black men were disenfranchised than in 1870, the year the 15th Amendment was ratified, prohibiting laws that explicitly deny the right to vote on the basis of race. Now, of course, during the Jim Crow era, poll taxes and literacy tests operated to keep black folks from the polls. Well, today, felon disenfranchisement laws accomplish what poll taxes and literacy tests ultimately could not. It was recently reported that a black child born today has less of a chance of being raised by both parents than a black child born during slavery. This is due in large part to the mass incarceration of black men. There was an article about this that ran recently in The Economist magazine entitled "How the Mass Incarceration of Black Men Harms Black Women." And the article explained that the majority of black women in the United States are unmarried, including about 70% of black professional women, and that this is due in large part to the mass incarceration of black men, which takes them out of the dating pool at the years that they would be most likely to commit to a partner, to a family. But what's worse is that it renders them permanently unemployable in the legal job market, virtually guaranteeing that a large majority of them will cycle in and out of the criminal justice system for the rest of their lives. In this way, mass incarceration has decimated black families to a degree comparable to slavery. In some major urban areas, more than half of working-age African-American men have criminal records and are thus subject to legalized discrimination for the rest of their lives. In fact, in Chicago, if you take into account prisoners, who of course are excluded from poverty statistics and unemployment data, thus greatly exaggerating the well-being of the African-American community. In fact, standard black unemployment rates, if you were to include prisoners, you would add about 15 to 25 percentage points to that figure. But it was reported in 2004 that if you take into account prisoners, nearly 80% of working-age African-American men in the Chicago area have criminal records and are thus subject to legalized discrimination for the rest of their lives. These men are part of a growing undercaste, not class, caste. A large group of people defined largely by race who are relegated to a second-class citizenship by law and custom for the rest of their lives. Now, I find when I tell people today that, I think that mass incarceration is, the new Jim Crow, or that mass incarceration functions a lot like slavery, people usually, react to me with a shocked disbelief. They say, well, how can you say that? Just look at Barack Obama, just look at Oprah Winfrey, look at Condoleezza Rice, look, and the list goes on of, high-profile, visible African Americans who have made it, who have achieved great wealth, power, and fame, is proof that nothing like a caste system could possibly exist in the United States today. But of course, the reality is that no caste system in the United States has ever governed all black people. There have always been free blacks and black success stories, even during slavery and Jim Crow. During slavery, there were some black slave owners, not many, but some. And during Jim Crow, there were some black lawyers and some black doctors, not many, but some. Now, the extraordinary nature of individual black achievement in formerly white domains certainly suggests that the old Jim Crow system is dead. But it doesn't necessarily mean the end of racial caste. If history is any guide, it may have just taken a different form. I think any honest observer of American racial history has to acknowledge that the rules and reasons the legal system employs to enforce status relations of any kind, they evolve and they change as they're challenged. In the first chapter of the book, I describe the cyclical rebirths of racial caste in America. African Americans have repeatedly been controlled through institutions like slavery and Jim Crow, which appear to die, but then are reborn in new form, tailored to the needs of the time. Of course, following slavery, a new system was born to replace slavery, known as convict leasing. After the Civil War, black men were arrested en masse, typically for minor crimes like loitering and vagrancy. It was our nation's first prison boom. They were arrested, sent to prison, and then leased to plantations. The idea, of course, was that they had to earn their freedom, but the catch was they could never pay back their plantation owner enough, to cover the costs of their clothing and shelter, and so they were effectively re-enslaved for the rest of their lives. Douglas Blackman has written an excellent book about this called Slavery by Another Name. Well, today, I think our criminal justice system has been used once again in a manner that effectively recreates caste in America. Now, for those who find that kind of claim hard to swallow, I say consider the facts. Our prison system has quintupled in a period of about 30 years for reasons that have stunningly little to do with crime. We've gone from a prison population from about 300,000 to well over 2 million. We now are the world's leading incarcerator. Yet crime rates have gone up, have gone down, today are at historical lows. Most criminologists and sociologists today will acknowledge crime rates and incarceration rates in the United States, they've moved independently of one another. Imprisonment rates have soared regardless of whether crime has been going up or down in any given community or the nation as a whole. And yet Black imprisonment in particular has consistently soared. It was reported several years ago that in Washington, D.C., our nation's capital, 3 out of 4 young Black men in nearly all those in the poorest neighborhoods could expect to serve time in prison. Rates nearly as shocking can be found in other poor communities of color across America. So what happened? What happened? Well, the answer is a war was declared. A war was declared on poor communities of color, a Get Tough movement and a war on drugs that has decimated poor communities of color. In fact, drug convictions have been the engine of mass incarceration and the emergence of a new racial undercast. If you take a look at the period between 1985 and 2000, nearly 2/3 of the increase in the federal system were due to drug convictions alone, and more than half of the increase in the state system was due to drug convictions alone. By the year 2000, there were more people returning to prison on probation and parole violations than had been locked up for all offenses in 1980. So this massive new prison system was born, and millions of people became shuttled into the system primarily for nonviolent offenses and drug-related offenses, swept into the system, branded criminals and felons, and then released into a permanent second-class status for life. Now, the drug war has been waged almost exclusively in poor communities of color, even though studies have now shown for decades that, contrary to popular belief, people of color are no more likely to use or sell illegal drugs than whites. In fact, in some surveys, it indicates that white youth are actually more likely to engage in illegal drug dealing than Black youth. But that's not what you would guess by looking inside our nation's prisons and jails, which are overflowing with Black and brown drug offenders. In some states, 80 to 90% of all drug offenders sent to prison have been African American. But still, people will say to me, well, the reason we're waging the drug war in those ghetto communities, in those poor communities of color, is because that's where the violent offenders are, that's where the drug kingpins are, so it makes sense for us to be waging the war in those communities. In fact, most people assume that the war on drugs was declared in response to the emergence of crack cocaine in inner city communities and the related violence. But that's not true. It's not true. The war on drugs was officially declared by President Ronald Reagan in 1982. President Richard Nixon was the first to coin the term a war on drugs, but it was President Ronald Reagan who turned that rhetorical war into a literal one. And at the time he declared that drug war, drug crime was actually on the decline, not on the rise. It was a couple years before, not after crack first hit the streets. So why was this drug war declared? Because Ronald Reagan wanted to make good on campaign promises to get tough on a group of people who had not so subtly been defined as Black or brown in the media and the political discourse. The war on drugs and the Get Tough movement was part of a Republican Party strategy, known as the Southern Strategy, of using racially coded Get Tough appeals on issues of crime and welfare to appeal to poor and working class whites, particularly in the South, who were threatened by, resentful of, anxious about many of the gains of African Americans in the civil rights movement. Poor and working class whites, had their world rocked by the civil rights movement. Wealthy whites could send their kids to private schools and give their kids all the advantages that wealth had to offer. But it was poor and working class whites whose kids might potentially be subject to a desegregation order. It was their kids who were going to be having to compete for the first time on equal terms with this whole group of people that they've been taught their whole lives to believe were inferior to them for, decent jobs. And this anxiety and resentment was fertile ground for politicians who wanted to exploit those racial divisions. And pollsters and political strategists found that by using get-tough rhetoric on issues of crime and welfare, that they could persuade poor and working class whites in the South to defect from the Democratic New Deal coalition and join the Republican Party in droves. Well, the Reagan administration got lucky because a couple of years after the drug war was declared, crack hit the streets and spread to inner city communities across the country. And the Reagan administration seized on this development with glee, hiring staff whose job it was to feed stories to the media of crack babies, crack dealers, crack users, the so-called crack whores, in the hopes of turning crack into a media sensation, which they believed would bolster public support for the war and guarantee that millions more dollars would flow to waging it. And the plan worked like a charm. Almost overnight, television sets were flooded with images of crack babies, crack users, crack dealers, and soon Democrats began competing with Republicans to prove who could be tougher on them. And so it was President Bill Clinton who presided over the most dramatic escalation of the drug war at the same time as he ended welfare as we know it, all in an effort to appeal to that same group of white swing voters, a task that was made easier once crack had actually hit the streets and violence had become a real problem in these communities. And it was the Clinton administration who championed laws banning drug offenders from public housing and denying them even food stamps for the rest of their life. And within an incredibly short period of time, we suddenly had millions of poor people of color locked into a permanent second-class status, having to check that box on employment applications, have you ever been convicted of a felony, for the rest of their lives. Leaving prison unable, barred even from public housing, families risking eviction if they even let their family members return home to them, people being barred even for food stamps for the rest of their lives. What are folks supposed to do? Can't get a job, barred from housing. Food stamps may even be off limits to you. Well, what we expect people to do is to pay hundreds or thousands of dollars in fees, fines, court costs, accumulated back child support, and in a growing number of states, the costs of a year imprisonment. And then get this, even if you're one of the lucky few who managed to get a job, up to 100% of your wages can be garnished to pay back all these fees, fines, court costs, accumulate back child support. What is the system designed to do? It seems designed to send people right back to prison, which is what in fact happens about 70% of the time. About 70% of released prisoners return within 3 years, and the majority of those who return do so in a matter of months because the challenges associated with mere survival on the outside are so immense. So what do? I say nothing short of a major social movement has any hope of ending mass incarceration in America. If we were to go back to the rates of incarceration we had in the 1970s, a time when many civil rights activists thought that rates of incarceration were just egregiously high, if we were just to go back to those bad old days, we would have to release 4 out of 5 people who are in prison today. More than 1 million people employed by the criminal justice system would lose their jobs. So I believe it's going to take a major social movement, not just mere tinkering with the system or piecemeal policy reform. Thank you.
I have a couple of, thank you.